Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. The webinar focuses on inclusive governance. So we know there's consensus that good governance promotes citizen participation, pluralism, equity, inclusion, accountability, and transparency. Inclusive governance is critical to addressing the needs of immigrants and other minoritized communities. It is at the local level and at the state level requires specific strategies that ensure that the government's response to local needs is optimal. There are basically two overarching approaches that local governments employ. One is a mainstreaming approach where services and programs are adapted to address the needs of immigrants. And the other approach is a tailored approach where there are separate programs and services that are offered to address those needs that are unique to this population. More often than not, however, there's a need to combine these two approaches because there are pros and cons of each. And by combining the two approaches, you're trying to address disadvantages that come in with one or the other. So regardless of the approaches taken, local governments are responsible for integrating immigrants into the fabric of their communities by ensuring services and programs that address their unique needs, promote welcoming climates that foster social cohesion and prevent discrimination, foster trust and sense of belonging, and institute place-based initiatives that guard against segregation and discrimination. Immigrants are members of the local communities whose needs and voices must be reflected in all local policies and practices. We have invited experts from local government, from civil society, to help us unpack what we mean by inclusive governance and examine what it takes to institute inclusive governance at the local level. We also will talk about what barriers and challenges we face in maintaining inclusive governance structures, and most importantly, we will examine what models exist, successful, promising models, to implement inclusive governance frameworks. So we have special remarks by David Kadur, and it's my pleasure to welcome him to the table here, to the stage. David Kadur is the Human Mobility Advisor within the Recovery Solutions and Human Mobility team at the United Nations Development Programs, UNDP. And Dr. Kadur will provide a global perspectives on promising models of creating welcoming communities where all members are able to cultivate a sense of belonging and cultivate trust in the institutions of government. Thank you for being here, Dr. Kadur. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Dina, and hello, everybody. Just have to correct a little bit. I left UNDP a few months ago, so I don't work anymore for UNDP, at least directly. I am connected with Yale University as a fellow at the Morse College, and I work as an international expert on migration and displacement issues. Just want to clarify that. So I'm not talking at all on behalf of UNDP. But I hope I can bring lots of experience from my years at the UN and also at the OECD in Paris and UNDP in New York and in Latin America. So that being said, we have a big question ahead of us. I think it's very clear that we live in a period where the question of migration is a very, very, very sensitive issue. I think that's very clear for everybody. And therefore, the question of inclusive governance and social cohesion is a very key one. Even though, of course, in current context, especially in the US, is it a priority? Not for everybody, that's for sure, but hopefully it stays a priority for many of us. So in terms of human mobility, and when we talk about human mobility, that encompasses voluntary migration, whatever voluntary means, and forced displacement. So we are talking about migrant workers, students, refugees, asylum seekers, so all the categories of people on the move. And it's obvious that there are growing pressures today in the world toward more human mobility. First, because of growing international inequalities. And we shouldn't forget that most people in the world move for economic reasons in search of better opportunities. And because there are inequalities, wealthy countries, not so wealthy countries, people are going toward these wealthiest countries. So this is a big issue. And let's not forget that when you hit countries, you take measures like increasing tariffs. This is affecting economic development in the partner countries, which eventually might translate into more migration from these countries, not fewer migration. That's an important point to highlight. Then, of course, we have growing numbers of political crises and conflicts. Everybody knows about Ukraine, about Venezuela, Haiti, but there are also wars and big conflicts where nobody or very few people hear about, like in Sudan, like in Democratic Republic of the Congo, and there are millions of people who are displaced within their countries, but also increasingly out of their countries. So more pressures, and of course the effects of climate change. We have seen what happened in LA recently. These incidents, these tragedies, they are happening in a growing number of countries around the world. And we can take the example of the dry corridor in Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, that affects livelihoods in these countries. And that's also an additional factor of having people migrating. So more pressures on the one hand, and on the other hand, and that's maybe a paradox or not, there are also more trends towards more restrictive migration policies, and there is a significant increase in anti-immigrant feelings. So, and we know that these anti-immigrant feelings are fed by some people taking advantage. We know that in many cases, at least when people migrate in the first place, they don't vote. And that's an issue about inclusive governance we can talk about. Foreigners don't vote in most countries. Sometimes they can vote at the local level, not at the national level. And so they are very easy to scapegoat because as a politician, you are not going to face the repercussions of talking badly about foreigners. They are not going to vote until they become citizens, but that's long term, and many politicians don't care about long term. So also it's a narrative which is easy to understand. Why so many politicians are talking about immigration as a problem? Because it's easy. You understand that, oh, there are foreigners and we have problems, hence the foreigners are the responsible for our problems. And this is not new. If you just take the US, it has happened since the US exists, mostly since the 19th century. US citizens were blaming the Irish. They were Catholic, and that was an issue, and they were blaming the Italians, and they were not Anglo-Saxon, and that was an issue. They were blaming the Chinese. The first law against immigrants in the world, as far as I know, was taken in 1882. It was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was taken by the US, mostly with a strong lobbying from Californians congressmen who wanted to be protected from Chinese immigration. And then it was the Jews and lots of the exclusion acts in 1921, 1924, who hit a lot the population from Eastern Europe, i.e. The Jews in many cases. And now it's Latinos and Muslims. And so there has been a long tradition, but not just in the US. I mean, I am from France, you can hear from my accent, and it's exactly the same in my country. So what does it mean? It means for people like me, people who like some of you, I guess, who have been working on issues of migration, and we can talk about a failed narrative. We have tried to show the positive contribution of migrants and displaced people. We have a global compact for migration that recognizes this positive contribution. We have the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Development Agenda that highlights the positive contribution of migrants and displaced people. That is refugees, asylum seekers. We have lots of empirical evidence that shows that there is a positive contribution of migrant workers, of refugees, or the best case, there is no impact. There is no impact on wages, maybe in the short term, not in the medium term or long term. There is no fiscal impact. Migrants contribute, they are not a burden. There is no evidence of an increase in insecurity. Sometimes it's even the other way around. So we don't have evidence. We just have negative perceptions. And sometimes, yes, at the local level, short term, we might have negative effects. But overall, immigration is positive for the economies, for the societies of host countries. And yet, this is not working. This kind of narrative, the counter narrative, is the one which is working, as everybody can know. So what can we do? Well, we need to promote socioeconomic integration, and we need to promote social cohesion. And this is why we are here to discuss today. I want to highlight the question of socioeconomic integration before I enter into the question of social cohesion, because I think it's very important. We cannot just take immigrants as the beneficiaries of programs. They have to be agents of development. They have to, I mean, they work, most of them. They go to schools, they contribute, they pay taxes. And so it's important to recognize this and not just, oh, they are victims, they are beneficiaries of our program. So that also contributes to changing the narrative. This is why I think it's important to start talking about socioeconomic integration. It means what can we do in terms of public policies at the national, at the local level, in terms of programming, so that there is a better access to labor markets, better access to education and skills. Many times skills are not recognized. So education, it's easier. We recognize foreign degrees, but what about skills? How someone who has been working during 10 years abroad in some job with no degree, how can we recognize these skills? So that's also very important. Promote entrepreneurship. And also access to social protection. Many times people are excluded from social protection mechanisms. And it's also important to have, and sorry, it's not very well accepted today in the US, but we need to have a gender responsive approach to taking into account the different aspects of immigrants and refugees and taking into account the specific challenges that women in particular face in terms of integration. And the good news is that the more we invest in integration, the higher the contribution of migrant workers and refugees to their host countries. So it's a win-win situation. We invest, we promote socioeconomic integration, and foreigners contribute even more to our economies and to our societies. The challenge is it's not that easy, of course. We would know if it were easy, that we also need in this integration process to involve host communities. And I think sometimes the mistake is that we focus too much on people on the move, on migrants, on refugees, asylum seekers, and we forget the host communities. And we need to incorporate host communities into the policy agenda to avoid tensions. And this is when it comes to social cohesion. So let's talk about social cohesion in the time I have left. So of course, we could start talking about what is social cohesion. I think it's a big question, and for sure I won't solve it in 10 seconds or even 10 minutes. So even 10 hours. But some definition is about trust, the extent of trust, how do we trust in our government and within society, and how we want to participate collectively toward a shared vision of peace, of development, of what is our society. And this is a big challenge. And of course, today in the US, we know that there is no shared vision of what the US is. We live in a very polarized society. And again, not just in the US, but particularly in the US. And so when we talk about social cohesion, there are two dimensions. There is a vertical dimension. It's the relationship between us as individuals and the institutions, the representatives of the institution. It can be the national state or the federal state in the case of the US, or local authorities, and also the national state and local authorities. And so how much trust as citizens do we have in our government? And we know that's an issue. And then there is the horizontal dimension, which is kind of the intergroup cohesion. It's how are our relationships with other individuals? So it's a question of trust in our neighbors, in the rest of the society, in how do we contribute in associations, and so on and so forth. So this is a working definition of social cohesion, and taking into account these vertical and horizontal dimensions. When it comes to migration, how can we promote social cohesion? I don't want to be lengthy on that. I will take three very specific cases, which I hope will help in our discussion today. So the first one is, how can we change the narrative and combat prejudice and discrimination? And in that case, we have to use information awareness raising campaigns. The thing is, we know that works, but it also doesn't work. Lots of information, lots of campaigns, and still they don't know. So I want to mention an interesting example that UNDP has been doing a few years ago in Latin America. In 14 countries, we tested the impact of a campaign against discrimination against Venezuelans and see what works. So there were 3 videos. One video was about facts. These are the Venezuelans, they are migrating because of this and that. And these are their conditions in the countries where they arrive. The second video was more, I would say, cheesy. It was about a Venezuelan lady working as a domestic worker, victims. So the purpose was to cry. And the third video was migration. So just a random video as control. And so what happened in these countries overall, not entering into details, but interestingly, the people, and so there were questions before the videos and after the videos, and about the perceptions about Venezuelans. And interestingly, so of course, the third video had no impact about the perceptions about Venezuelans. The second video had a positive impact, but not so much, the cheesy one. And the one that affected the most was the first one, facts. People were changing their mind because they understood. And I think it's very important. And of course, we know that it doesn't always work, but just informing people, we assume that we know why people are here. Many times people don't know the situation in the country. So informing at the local level, telling them, look, these are your new neighbors. They are here because of this situation in the country, explaining the situation, explaining that they had to leave. It was not a choice in the case of refugees. And so these kind of things apparently work. That's just an example, but it was run in 14 countries and the results were similar across the 14 countries. So this is the kind of things that we need to do. It's not enough, but it's a good start. So the first point was changing narrative through information and awareness raising campaigns. The second way of changing and promoting social cohesion is involving the communities in decision and implementation processes. So community-based interventions, and it goes both ways. So first, inviting representatives from refugees organizations, migrant workers, in taking part in decisions at the local level, in decisions that affect them. After the Ukrainian crisis, I went to Moldova, and we worked with the Moldovan government about inclusion of Ukrainian refugees. And one important decision was to involve Ukrainians in the decisions, the budget for integration, how it will be used. Ukrainians were invited to this discussion. What should be done? What should be the priorities? So it was not a top-down decision from the government about what should be done with refugees. It was involving refugees in these decisions, and that is very important. But also, as I said, it works both ways, involving the community in this decision, because they want to be informed why our budget, meaning our taxes, why our taxes are used this way, that way. So it's important to involve them also in the decisions. When there was the Venezuelan crisis, we had an issue with cash transfers in many countries in South America, because there were lots of cash transfers for Venezuelans, and local populations were saying, but why? We are poor too, we have issues too, and you are only supporting the Venezuelans, you are not taking into account our issues. And so if you don't take into account the problems, the vulnerabilities that local populations are facing, you are generating more tensions. Yes, you help part of the population, but you generate tensions with the rest of the population that feel that they also have needs. So this is why these community-based interventions need to involve also the communities. And then the third action is how you can bring people together, people on the move, and the host communities to work together towards, for instance, public good provision. I'm going to explain that through intergroup collaboration. And again, so how you make feel that immigrants are contributing, but directly, not just with information campaigns or just with facts, because we know that facts in this world are not enough. And something that worked well, so I spent many years in Colombia, and I supported the government with the Venezuelan crisis. So I again take this example, but we had a mechanism. It was called the Banco Amable in Spanish. In English, it would be the Kind Bank. And it was a voluntary program where Venezuelans were working together with people from the community to embellish the community, to do programs for the community. So for instance, you would take a Saturday and everybody was going out and painting schools or planting trees in gardens, and they had all orange jackets. So people could see them, and there was a campaign all day and showing we are working together as a community. And it was amazing because it helped a lot change the way the local community was perceiving people from Venezuela. There was a very negative perception. They are here, they are taking our jobs, they are stealing, we feel insecure. And suddenly they were, oh, they're helping. Our schools look better thanks to them. We have more trees. We have safer communities because it looks nicer. And these campaigns were very well perceived by the population, but also talking with the migrants, they were saying, we feel useful. It's not just that we receive support from the community, we are also contributing to the community. And there was a sense of belonging and kind of empowerment from the population, in particular women who were participating felt, I don't have a job. It's very difficult to integrate here. But at least now I am also contributing. I'm not just benefiting from public support. And this was extremely useful to build social cohesion, to build trust across communities, and also with a positive outcome because the community was much better after than before. So these are just examples, but I think examples are good because they help understand the problems, and also they can give other ideas to others in communities about how we can work together to change the narratives, change perceptions, build trust, social cohesion, and at the end not see migration as a problem, but really as something which is positive for everybody. Thanks.
Dr. Kadur, thank you so much. This has been a really rich presentation. Thank you for perfectly laying the groundwork for the discussion that will follow, and for highlighting three very important strategies for inclusive governance: the changing of the narratives to combat discrimination and raise awareness about the contributions of immigrants, and involving the communities in decision making. It brings back the slogan, nothing about us without us, really, and the communities need to be part of that decision making on anything that affects them. And the third is the civic engagement and bringing the communities together. The more we narrow the distance, the more we shatter those stereotypes and build social cohesion. Thank you all. Thank you very, very much for this wonderful presentation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. Each panelist will have 3 to 5 minutes to provide remarks on their experiences in inclusive governance from the vantage point of their experience in either local government or civil society. And our first panelist is the Honorable Barrero Acoforo, councilman at the Albany County Legislature. He's the first African-born immigrant elected to the Albany County Legislature, and the first Nigerian-born immigrant elected to public office in the state of New York. We were talking earlier about Barrero, and I said, the fact that you are representing the community is a perfect example of what we talk about when we say representative government, and what you highlighted, Dr. Kador, of really having the voices of the communities at the table. Next is Nellie Felderman. She's an expert on community response to immigrant integration and on creating welcoming and inclusive communities. And she is part of the team at the Community Sponsorship Hub. Luis Montez is a seasoned public affairs and political consultant with over 20 years of experience in state, county, and local government. And Dr. Woksu Kim is the director of the Immigrant and Refugee Research Institute at the University of Buffalo, who's worked with local government to address the needs of new Americans. So each of our panelists will share their perspective on the theme of the discussion that we're having on inclusive governance. Then we will open up the floor to address audience questions and get into deeper discussions about these issues and how really to operationalize these strategies on the ground. And while our panelists are delivering their remarks, please feel free to include your questions and comments in the chat. That's the only way we can interact with you, the audience. So please include your comments and questions in the chat box, and we will address as many as we can once we get to the discussion section after our panelists deliver their remarks. So we will start with Councilman Ecoforo. You are muted, Councilman.
Thank you very much. And that was a very great opening by David Kodor. Thank you for that. And thank you, Dina, for having us today. You've pretty much introduced myself. I'm a county legislator in the county of Albany. Albany is the capital of New York State. And I came here to Albany initially in 2012 from New York City. I'm originally from Nigeria, and I came here to Albany in 2012 for school. And while I was there at the University at Albany, I founded the International Organization for Education, which is an organization with the goal or aim of promoting literacy both in the United States and internationally. That was founded in 2013. And then in 2017, we got approval for consultative status with the United Nations, ECOSOC, which is Economic and Social Affairs Council. So since then, we have been working and participating in meetings at the United Nations. In 2019, I got elected to the Albany County Legislature to represent the Pine Hills and the Beaverwick neighborhood. I became the first African elected to the Albany County Legislature, and also the first Nigerian immigrant elected in the state of New York. I'll talk a little bit about my nonprofit organization, since we are talking about this conference about the immigrant community. So with the International Organization for Education, we pretty much in 2014, after we founded the organization, we started a partnership with the Literacy New York of the Greater Capital Region. Literacy New York is an organization in the capital region of New York that help immigrants with English as a second language, with citizenship test preparations and other assistance to the immigrant community in New York State. So we started teaching English as a second language. Myself, I became an instructor after receiving some training from the Literacy New York of the Greater Capital Region. I started my own literacy program to help immigrants in Albany to teach them English as a second language. So that went on for about 2 years. And then during the pandemic, we had to stop that program due to the pandemic because people could not come to classes anymore. And we were just a small organization at that time. The organization is still functional. The International Organization for Education is still functional, and we still have consultative status with the United Nations. We have been working still with the immigrant community here in Albany, and we hope to continue that even as a county legislator now, and also working with the immigrant community and the state as a whole. I will leave it at that for now and wait for more questions and let other people introduce themselves.
Thank you so much, Professor Birrero. Let's move on to Nellie Feldman. Nellie.
Thank you, everyone. And it's really, thank you, Dina. Thank you, Guillermo, for having me today. It is such a pleasure to be with this group of people today morning. So my name is Nele Feldman. I'm the Director for Welcome Corn Campus at the Community Sponsorship Hub. But today I'm really here sort of in my personal capacity. That said, you will hear me, my comments are really around the work that I've been doing at the Community Sponsorship Hub, but also previously at the Global Task Force on Third Country Education Pathways and as the Director for Scholarships for Displaced Students at the Institute of International Education. But really, I think I want to go back to what David said. I think at the Community Sponsorship Hub, it is in our name, right? We're really focusing on the role that communities can play in sort of changing the narrative and the perception around resettlement. Our organization is really focused on refugee resettlement, but I do think that a lot of the lessons learned and a lot of the programming translate very well into just working with broader immigrant populations or asylees, asylum seekers in the United States. But then I know that community sponsorship is not only a concept in the United States, it really is a concept also in Europe. But really we want to see how can we provide local solutions to global problems and challenges. And I think really importantly, how can we actively engage local communities in the resettlement process, really bringing them into the decision-making process on how we welcome. I don't want to say necessarily who we welcome, but of course there have been new initiatives over the last years that also do give some agencies to communities in terms of, who are the people that we are welcoming in our communities. And I think that can be a really interesting point of discussion, and there might be, varying opinions around this. By my title, the Welcome Corn Campus, you might hear that I'm really focused on higher education and the role that higher education institutions can play in welcoming refugee, displaced, and immigrant students. And I really do see higher education communities as, smaller communities within a broader community. And I will say that over decades, institutions in their communities, in their states, have stepped up to welcome displaced populations, immigrant populations, refugee populations. And I think a lot of times, right, this is not the way we phrased it. It's really never as charity. These are very bright, brilliant, and ambitious individuals, regardless of, what their exact immigration status is, who want to contribute. I think going back to David's point, right? They want to be part of their host communities. They want to participate in their host communities, and they want to contribute. And I think I once heard, once you have your first job, you stop being a refugee, right? Because again, I usually work with a lot of refugees. And I think in our scenario, working a lot with universities, they do realize and recognize the potential that refugees, immigrants, asylees bring to their classrooms. It does tie in very well with internationalizing classrooms. It's a really difficult word for an immigrant myself. It really ties into meeting local labor needs. So again, right, a lot of times those individuals remain in their communities and can also provide significant support to the local labor market. And I think it just like more broadly really responds to the responsibility that a lot of institutions see in the United States to provide a high quality education to really everyone, right? That is kind of the core mission of higher education. What we have also seen in the process, that when universities decide that they want to support refugee, asylee, immigrant student populations, we a lot of times, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this a little later, we do hear the argument, why would we want to support a refugee student if we have so many local students, domestic students in our communities who cannot afford going to college, especially in a country where university and higher education is very much tuition driven. I think what I will say from our experience, more times than not, we have seen that the infrastructure and the support systems that campuses have developed and are developing, they never do this to only support one specific student population and then limit themselves to that student population. They really do this with a much bigger purpose of supporting any and all underserved, low-income, first-generation students. So this is not an either-or situation, but by actively engaging communities, by actively engaging different departments, right? Again, a university is a small community within a bigger community. With our programs, we're bringing together students on campus, administrators, faculty, and in bringing together and almost sometimes forcing them to work together to really establish if they have the resources necessary to welcome refugee students, they discover that the systems they're building on campus and the systems and the outreach they're doing off campus, right, to the broader community is beneficial to their whole entire student population. I really cannot stress this point enough. And I really think that it's always important to think about all of the infrastructure that, communities are building, that local governments are building, that usually they really do benefit the broader population. Last but not least, taking a step away from the campus, one of our biggest partners have always been community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, churches, synagogues, mosques, and then, of course, immigrant-led organizations. And the really big benefit that we have seen in working actively with those groups is that they have the trust of the immigrant population, because a lot of times they do employ people who have lived experience. Or if they don't necessarily have people with lived experience, they have worked with these populations for decades, right? So, and they also have the connections to communities. I mean, every community can mobilize, but a lot of times we see that especially faith-based organizations, but also universities, those who really hold a sort of significant position in their, in their communities, have that capacity to mobilize, have that capacity to bring people together, to support immigrant populations, to sort of, have open conversations regarding, is this something that their community can absorb? Where are the challenges? What are the fears? But again, really trying to actively engage communities in welcoming immigrant and refugee populations. And then I think my very last comment is, as someone who has welcomed refugees myself with our local community, I don't want to diminish the role that local government and government overall plays. I'm from Germany, which is a more government heavy, I guess, country. But I will say that I think David said this is again like a situation, or maybe Dina, you said it in introduction. We really need kind of the local governments, but also the more targeted, to work hand in hand to create the solutions that I think our communities need, our states need, our country needs, and to really bring people along in this process. And again, our work very much focuses on the host communities. It very much focuses on the individuals, and we call them volunteers or sponsors, who are actually directly engaging. And I would argue that once you tell people in communities how they can help, there's a lot of curiosity. There's a lot of questions. There might be some challenges and criticism, but I think really reaching out communities provides that opportunity to actively step in, to actively support and engage, and to also be an active part of conversations around any potential challenges that people may see coming up, when you host, be it refugees or immigrants or refugee students, but people do want to help. And I think a lot of times it is very much about making sure that communities understand how they can help, and then really creating opportunities for them to help. And I'm going to give it back to Dina.
Thank you, Nelly. All right. So Dr. Waksu Kim, the floor is yours.
Sorry, it took me a while to find the unmute button. So, hi, as I was introduced, my name is Uksu Kim. I will start by sharing my academic journey a little bit. My research primarily focused on the well-being and the acculturation of Asian immigrant populations in the United States. In particular, I have been studying diversity within Asian American communities in mental health and behavioral health, and demonstrating that one-size-fits-all approach simply doesn't work. This applies not only to Asian Americans, but also to any minorities or racial groups. However, it is especially problematic for Asian Americans because of the persistent model minority myth, the assumption that Asians are always doing fine. This is very problematic because this myth artificially created divide between minority groups and often prevents Asian Americans from receiving the support they truly need. In 2014, after I got tenured, I co-founded and now direct the Immigrant and Refugee Research Institute at our school. For those who are unfamiliar with the Buffalo area, I will provide a little bit of background. Recently, in the last 2 decades or so, the Buffalo has become the home to many new Americans, primarily refugees, who have arrived since the early 2000s, so 2005-ish, that's the start of it. And then these communities have played a pivotal role in revitalizing one of the Rust Belt cities, Buffalo. So now often we call it as a Buffalo Renaissance. It was created by these refugees with their contributions by bringing culture, labor, and aspirations for success. They bring in all sorts of things that revitalize this region. But resettlement isn't easy, as it was discussed already, and they can't build a new life from nothing. So they need support, especially during the initial resettlement stage. Because of my role at the Institute, the name of the Institute includes Immigrant and Refugees. I was invited to discussions and refugee issues. Initially, I was reluctant, believing that as a researcher, I should only talk about my specific area of expertise, Asian American acculturation, their mental health, mostly East Asian Americans, but not beyond. However, over time, refugee well-being has become central to my research for the past 10 years or so. I have worked closely with the refugee communities in various capacities, serving on their boards and conducting community-based participatory research. In these CBPR projects, I addressed critical issues such as healthcare access and mental health and health literacy, those the health and mental health related stuff. Currently, I am evaluating a county-run workforce development program where half of the participants come from refugee backgrounds. I'm also collaborating with local agencies on needs assessment for refugees with disabilities. And also, I am partnering with colleagues from the University of Buffalo Computer Science Department to create a STEM camp for children from refugee families. So my research has evolved beyond its original scope, and I can no longer simply say that I study acculturation and well-being among Asian Americans, Asian American immigrants in a kind of very narrow definition. My work is deeply embedded in the broader immigrant and refugee experience. One common thread that ties everything together in my research is community. As a social work researcher, I believe that research should be applied and meaningful, and the utility of my work is always at the forefront of my mind. So it took me over a decade to build a trusting relationship. So now I can really ask questions and be asked questions without the barrier of trust with the communities and other actors in the refugee-related services. Whether I'm actively collecting data or not, when the community calls, they are my priority. So that's who I am at this point. And yeah, of course, I do still publish, and despite everything I'm doing alongside the community I serve, and also based on everything I'm doing with the communities. Because I also believe that that's how I serve these communities as an academic. So in this panel, I will share, I hope I can share my perspectives on inclusive governance as an observer from my experiences working with refugee communities in Buffalo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. Last but absolutely not least, Luis Montez.
Thank you so much, Tina. And thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts. Today, I would like to concentrate on my experience as a former local government official here in Suffolk County. I would like to provide you a little context about Suffolk County for those of you who may not be familiarized with the jurisdiction. It is certainly the largest county in New York State outside of New York City. It has a population of about 1.5 million people. It is a prominent suburban county. that has a budget of about over $3 billion annually, which is basically, in terms of size and in terms of finances, puts him, it is larger than 13 states in the nation. So it is a pretty significant. It is the home also of, a very large immigrant community. Prominently, there is Salvadorans, there's Colombians, there's Ecuadorians, and Guatemalan, Costa Ricans, and a growing Mexican population. In Suffolk County was in the news for the longest when Guillermo and I had the pleasure of sharing work in the assembly because it was a very obscure era in Suffolk County. It was governed by a former assembly member that then became county executive, Steve Levy, who made a lot of headlines for particularly some of the rhetoric that we probably see now, like David was mentioning in his native friends from the Le Pens, like we don't have to go far and now to Trump, or in the case of Anelli in Germany from the, ADF. So it was a very, very extremist view, words that basically that were very offensive, like anchor babies and, all sorts of names. There were a couple of efforts basically to try to stop him. And it was, successfully at the end, he basically forfeited his campaign and ended up going. And that's when my former boss, Steve Ballone, came into place in 2012. Although the leadership, the government leadership at that time had left, you could only imagine the level and the deep wounds that such a leadership may cause in a community. The resentment between the well-established communities versus the newly arrived communities, it was always cause of friction, to the point that back in November of 2008, there was a very, very gruesome incident, the death or the killing of Marcelo Lucero in the village of Pacho, which basically was done by a group of teenagers who went pinner hopping, they call it, basically looking for immigrants on the street to beat them up, and ended up killing one. So that was basically the type of sentiment that those policies were generating. Fast forward 2012, Steve Ballone gets in. He gets in with a new vision of governance and leadership, a more inclusive, more. Then unfortunately, it is not, as you may know, many of the policies that you're trying to implement in terms of social justice, in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of making government more welcoming, depend a lot on the fiscal situation of those governments. And unfortunately, Suffolk County faced a huge deficit, over close to $750 million of a deficit. So it was very hard sometimes, to justify this type of policies, just because people are just they try to ponder or prioritize the fiscal situation rather than the actual policies that that will cement union within the communities. So in that sense, unfortunately, Suffolk County was hit by Superstorm Sandy at the end of October of 2012, which basically exposed a lot of the needs that government and the lack of government basically to appropriately communicate with communities. Before that, we had already established a working group with many of the CBOs, Make the Road. There were a couple other, groups, Sepa Mujeres. There were basically, it was a coalition of over 25 organizations that were constantly meeting, trying to basically fine-tune some of the policies that we were working on and try to get to this. But it was until November 2012, but basically, this is, again, as I said, we were dealing with a very precarious financial situation in Suffolk County, but at the same time, Superstorm Sandy basically exposed a lot of the problems that as a government we were having. And that's when we saw the opportunity basically to, since we had already been doing the work with these community groups, basically to go ahead right away and implement, and sign an executive order that it was the language access implementation, which, sometimes you would be surprised of how difficult it is in terms of public health, in terms of public safety, just to communicate, in an effective way with all the communities. This is a policy that, out of the 1.5 million people, over 150,000 people in Suffolk County would, benefit from, right? You're talking about over 10% of the population basically would have, that we could actually quantify. Remember, those are census numbers, right? Many of these numbers, many of the people that we have worked on, that we have worked in this field, we know that census is not something that we can 100% rely on, just because of the same fear that government, for the people have to deal with government, communicate with government. So many of the immigrant communities do not fill out the questionnaire, or simply do not answer the door. So with that, we were able to sign a language access executive order, which basically mandated the translation interpretation of vital documents of government and in 6 languages: Spanish, Mandarin, Italian, Portuguese, Creole, and Polish. So we do have a large population of Polish community here in Suffolk County, particularly in the area of Babylon and Riverhead, which is, something that is, I think, unique to the state, right? In that sense, I think that the issue of implementing that policy was not simple. The implementation itself, we left a period of a year just to basically coordinate with all the agencies. It's a large government for a local jurisdiction. We had to basically draft all the plans, the language access plans for every agency. We had to designate within those agencies. We had to designate someone that was going to be the coordinator of that program within those agencies. And that's when you sometimes see also the pushback from not only from the community, but also from labor, from the unions, right? These are things that you are basically working on that sometimes, because of the change that you are implementing, are not really typified in job descriptions. So for someone to take this new function is always, it has to be a volunteer, right? But at the same time, you have people that are just, that is not easy to adjust to change. And in that sense, we had to deal with that. We also had to deal with the cost situation. So we had to basically go out there and try to, see how we pay for this. And remember, one thing is from the administration, right? The executive order to do this. The other thing is go to the legislature, which, sometimes is not on the same page with the executive, and basically try to convince them that they have to allocate funds so that this policy can move forward and cannot be only a one-shot deal. So that's part of also of the implementation challenges that you face while when working on such a multidisciplinary policy. Then you had you had the issue of basically communicating with letting the community know, right? And like bringing the implementation to the very basic level to a patrol. And I'm talking about a police patrol, right? Like, how is it that interaction between a police patrol, like coming from all the way on the, on top of government, how can you bring it down to, to a CPA's worker, to a police officer, to basically the people that are on the front lines dealing with constituents? And I think that that's obviously some of the challenges that that these type of government policies face. That is like, as effective and as a good as they are, sometimes bringing those ideas down to fruition or to execution, it's always the challenge. There's always pushback. There's always, you have to train people. You have to go through all the proper channels, right? Including labor. Like sometimes dealing, and I do a lot of emphasis on labor because if someone knows a little bit about Suffolk County, you would know, for example, how powerful, for example, the police union is, the PBA, right? In Suffolk County. So those are real political either beneficiaries or obstacles that you can face when you are implementing such policy. You are basically, to a certain extent, disrupting the status quo, which normally brings very strong pushback. So we were able to, work. We put a lot of emphasis on communications. The New York Times basically came out and praised and basically made a contrast between the previous administration and the new administration. We always try to find ways to justify financially, basically the cost of just like not doing government, the liability that it generates, basically the lawsuits that I was generating, everything that I was generating. So we were trying basically to message those policies in terms of money, because at the end, unfortunately, that's what people understand. That's like in many times we try to approach this from a human rights perspective or from a human decency perspective. And at the end of the day, voters understand money, right? But they think it's like, oh, this is going to be a new tax, this is going to be a new fee. How is it going to be? How is this affecting me? And why don't they, learn English before they, ask for, as I believe David was talking about, like basically that they are beneficiaries of the system, right? So those are type of challenges that you face on the implementation. So with that, we worked together. We actually ended up. We constantly met with community groups also, and basically we set up a working committee from every agency in Suffolk County to meet with the language access advocates, the coalition that has been formed, and just basically make sure that they are part of the they were part of the process, because that's the other thing too. Like sometimes in when these policies happen, like they're announced, they're implemented, and then advocates are the last ones who actually get to know or the details of it. And and that's when you have the friction, right? The neighboring county, Nassau County, went through the same process after we did. But they forgot to consult, and they forgot to, do a lot of stuff. And then, not even a year after, they were facing lawsuits and facing a lot of problems. So I think that in that sense, it's something that those are some of the lessons that we learn. Basically, when you're implementing this type of policy, make sure that you keep the same type of engagement and excitement that you keep at the beginning. You have to sustain all throughout the implementation of the process. And obviously, it is hard sometimes for government because, as a government official, obviously, accountability is an issue that you're not used to, right? Or you don't want to be held to. And I think that that's something that, as a government official, you have to commit to that. You have to have an honest dialogue with the stakeholders, and make sure that basically everyone is on the same page. This is one. We later on we work on basically revamping the human rights law, which included a component of housing, included components of labor, a couple other things. But it was but it was something. Again, it was an effort that it was that basically that you have to not only work on the front end of the policy, but also on the back end of the policy of the implementation. Language access policy 5 years after it was enacted as an executive order, we were able to get it done. Also, codify it in the basically make it a law. So the legislature finally adopted the language access, and with that, basically, we guarantee that even if with the new administration, it was not going to be vulnerable to the discretion of the executive, to the county executive. Instead, it was it became a law, and it is still a law in Suffolk County. So with that, I will give it back to Dina and be ready for questions.
Luis, thank you so much, and thank you, Nell and Dr. Kim and Barrero. This has been incredible. It's really, Luis, what you just shared with us is an incredibly important case study of the complexity that involves in inclusive governance and in policy implementation. But you really highlighted the lessons learned, the engagement with the community, and the coordination that needs to happen, not just among the agencies and other local government agencies, but within the community, bringing the voices by creating these committees, but the sustained engagement lesson that you provided that is really needed. So I know we have some questions, but wanted to really highlight the competition and the divisions and polarization that happens within communities that are really the obstacle to social cohesion. And all of you have shared lessons and tips on really messaging and making the argument that we're really serving everybody. As Nell said, the infrastructure exists for everybody, but this seems to be throughout our history the main spoiler of social cohesion, the creation of us against them that gets to be exploited sometimes. And so obviously David gave us the example of the civic engagement and bringing the communities together, narrowing the distance. But are there, and of course the information and awareness campaigns that need to happen, but are there other whether messaging or programs that from your experience work besides obviously what the UNDP did and Nell is doing in her work of bringing the communities together? Are there any programs that you think are best practices in communities that can be championed by local governments to create the narrowing of the distance between the communities and guard against that competition or that divisive rhetoric that occur of you're providing for them and not us, and us against them, and the inability to see them as members of the community? And anybody, we welcome back Dr. Kaddour to the panel as well. And anybody can really chime in and give us some answers from where you're sitting.
So I'm going to try to keep it brief, and because time has already gone. But I was talking earlier about the English as a second language. And I think that is a great start to, integration of immigrants into communities. But what these programs face is an issue of funding. Funding from both private organizations, funding from the government, and perhaps individuals. I'll give you an example. When my program started, we were the English as a second language that we started through my organization. We were serving at least 20 individuals that were coming to the program regularly, and that was before the pandemic. And we wanted to continue serving these people, and I was sponsoring this service that we're providing with my own personal money. And we wanted to serve more people, and I also didn't want to continue using my own personal money because I know I have other obligations personally. So we reached out to organizations and foundations that were, supporting these type of programs, both nationally and internationally. And the one response that we continue to get from these organizations and foundations was that we already have organizations that we are supporting. We are not, accepting applications from new organizations. So every year these foundations already have the programs that they want to support and would not even view or review any other applications that they receive. And this became an issue because we were providing this service through another organization, and we wanted to serve more people and also didn't want to continue using my own personal money, but we could not get funding. And so at some point we had to stop the program. this is also an issue that there is not enough funding through our local governments to support these programs. And these are programs that can help, new immigrants to look for jobs, can help new immigrants to communicate with, other people in the United States to help them integrate. And so there is an issue of funding that needs to be, taken seriously. And the issue of them versus us is another thing that, when the issue of immigration was going on with New York City, and a lot of people were being transported from New York City to Albany, we had a legislation that wanted to basically count these individuals as if they are coming here to commit crime. And we had to stop it and say that these are human beings. And we have to, instead of looking at these individuals as criminals or as people who are being transported here to commit crimes, we have to look at them as human beings, and also look at them as to see, why are they coming to this country? What can we do to resolve the issues that they are having? Because we ourselves as Americans, we placed America as a superpower. And if we want to, hold on to that expectations, we have to see, why are these people coming to our country, as opposed to saying that, oh, let's block them, let's ship them to Cuba and keep them there and take them to wherever they are coming from. We have to, put on, like David said earlier, put on our humanitarian act and see people as human beings and people that can integrate culturally and socially into our communities. And also, people always say in my legislature, my colleagues, friends, they always say, if you want to see where people's priorities are, you have to follow the money. And so
Yes,
I think
absolutely.
we have to put money where we have to put money to help people integrate into communities.
Yes, actually, and this is an incredibly important point that Luis also pointed to with his comments on funding. And it relates to a question that Carletta Ferraro in the question and answer discussion board is asking. She says, I would love to see local governments and local grant makers sharing good practices with local communities and local organizations, and put conditions on new grants based on lessons learned and good practices. Is it realistic to ask in the U.S. context? Absolutely. I think local government has the obligation to support these programs. But Barrero, my thinking is that they also need to do needs assessment of the need in the local communities and fund how to address those needs. So, civil society organizations and community-based organizations need to coordinate and collaborate and address that fragmentation that is happening, because we have a system that is really fragmented and not coordinated, and perhaps really not responding to the needs, because we often don't know what the needs are. So I'll turn to David Kadur, who has his hands up. David.
Yeah, no, thank you. So
I think David is frozen. David, we lost you for a minute here. And I'll, Dr. Kim, perhaps we'll get David back. Dr. Kim, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about what you just said about this, what needs are in the community. So while we were waiting for him to come back. So I just wanted to share my experience about this, knowing what the needs are in the community, because we have to get connected with the local communities to understand what really needs are in the community. In my experience, real progress in terms of inclusive government comes when the government has the will to act and follows through on its commitment.
Right.
Back in 2016, as a director of the Institute, I was invited to serve on a county New Americans Advisory Committee. I remember this happened largely because the new administration then promoted strong anti-refugee and anti-immigrant sentiments, making it a particularly critical moment to support and engage the new American communities at that time. Also, after about 10 years of the resettlement history, they were large enough to show their presence. So it was about time to pay attention to them. It was an interesting experience. So unlike a previous effort, the New Americans Advisory Committee intentionally excluded refugee resettlement service providers, who were typically the ones speaking on behalf of refugees. And instead, they invited refugee community leaders directly. When this was a big step forward in terms of inclusion, there was a little bit practical challenges I saw. So lacking the real action items. So we weren't sure about the directions of the committee. What was the role of this committee? We weren't quite sure about that. Working as a translator for government services, or initiating or suggesting a new program the community need. So we were struggling a little bit in the beginning, and being a community leader isn't a paid job. So keeping them consistently engaged was difficult unless they saw their participation actually making a difference and actual actions there. So still, I have to give the county government the credit for taking that initial step to bring refugee voices to the table directly. Absolutely. Now, with the same administration entering its second term, I hope to see this kind of engagement continue. And there's a lot of energy and anxiety among refugee agencies right now, but I don't see meaningful actions from the county or city, just not yet. So I hope government at every level reach out to the communities to include them more than before. So just one last point that I wanted to make is that in my observation, it was interesting to see how much effort it takes from the communities to even get the government to the table for a conversation, just to call a meeting. But when the government calls the meeting with a good intention and a good direction, it happens so easily. The real question is whether we will focus on the central issue that matters to the community and follow through. So whether they can truly walk the talk and work collaboratively to build a trusting and lasting relationship with that benefits immigrant and refugee communities.
Absolutely. Very, very important, Dr. Kim. It cannot be a token, a body to or a smoke and mirror. It really, we have to listen to them and make serious efforts to address and incorporate their voices into the decision making. But it also, you're pointing out the need for the needs assessment done ahead of the grants, so that you are really providing grants that cover the needs and not saying, oh, we already are funding people on the ground, like Guerrero is saying, and we don't want anything else. And there's often a lack of evaluation and monitoring. You need to evaluate and monitor and see, you know, if you're addressing the needs, if these organizations that you're funding are addressing the needs, or are there gaps already? So, Dr. Kaddour, we have you back. Thank you for coming back.
Sorry about that. No, it's very interesting because even though I live in the US, I don't work with the US. I work for developing countries, but so to hear also experiences and good practices. No, a couple of things. The first is about this representation issue, is who represents migrants or who represents refugees. Sometimes it's an issue. I remember I was at the border with Venezuela and Colombia, and I wanted to meet with representatives from Venezuelans. And they told me we have 71 associations. And I was like, that's crazy, because if you have 71 partner organizations, who is really responsible, who you can talk to? So that's an issue. There's also these jokes with the Colombian community in the US. They say that if you have 2 Colombians in one place, then you have 3 associations representing Colombians. So this issue even though it's a joke, but sometimes it's based on reality. This issue about who represents is difficult, and so it's about also direct representation. So I was talking about the budget. There are places where the discussion about the local budget is discussed publicly, and citizens can go and be part of the discussion. Doesn't mean they vote, but at least they can be part of the discussion. And somehow this is, if we manage to, not that we need associations, we need representation, but sometimes it's also good to have a direct contact with citizens, above all on budget issues and what we are going to do to support refugees, for instance. And there have been issues and discussions now, and in particular from Beroro, about how we can do that. So we have budget constraints, and still we want to use part of this public budget. In this case, I'm not talking about foundations or private budget. I'm talking about public budget. So how we can use it for integration purposes and for social cohesion issues. And that's my last point briefly. My experience working on these issues is what's something that works pretty well is working with children, because children have less prejudice than the rest of the population, even though they have from what they hear at home. And so working in classrooms is important, but beyond classroom, what you can do in terms of sport, funding, sport activities where local kids can be with children, refugees, and build community from the kids. It's also very important. Or music classes, having activities where children from migrant communities and from host communities, they can be together, they can learn to play an instrument, they will have a concert at the end of the year. That creates also a sense of belonging. And oh, my friend is from Afghanistan, my friend is from Venezuela, from Haiti, and that helps really. I mean, and not just a narrative. There is empirical evidence and studies that show that this kind of investment, they are not big, and they contribute a lot to integration and social cohesion. Thanks.
Absolutely, Dr. Kadura, thank you. Now,
I think just like one comment that might actually, when I'm disagreeing with myself, I do see a big role for communities. I will also say that I think volunteers in communities, there is sort of like a certain time period, right? There's a bit of an expiration period on how long do they remain engaged? How long can they sort of maintain their energy? And I think what we have seen with our university programming is if you have an opportunity to have, let's say, one person who is funded, right, in a coordinating position, who can really sort of continue, build community, mobilize, build infrastructure, it also makes it easier for a time of a downturn to ramp back up in the future. And I think it is hard to solely for a very long term and sustainably rely on volunteers in communities, right? So I do think that if there is a commitment from towns, municipalities, counties, states for at least some funding to have those coordinating positions who can really continue mobilizing for local involvement. I think that we have seen that is a critical part on university campuses. It sort of sometimes organically happens where one year this group is involved and then they share with others, and by doing that they mobilize others. But I do think that certainly to the funding question, there needs to be some investment. I think it's difficult. There's a lot of fabulous foundations out there, but I think foundation money comes and goes. It's very challenging to rely on that to build, a sustainable infrastructure. So I'm not offering necessarily any solutions, but I do think that again we can build on community. On the energy in communities, but I also think to make it more sustainable, there needs to be a commitment to have people who actually work on building that community and maintaining that community.
Very important points now. the idea of a coordinator who is paid and a volunteer coordinator and can really organize and mobilize and keep the engagement active is very important. And to David's points, the education system is an incredibly important site for social integration. And we know there are models in Europe that also through that active, intentional, and deliberate engagement of children in the educational system and their parents, they're able really to bridge some of that distance and some of that isolation and segregation that is happening in many communities. So very important strategies here that are driving the social cohesion question. We have an inquiry in the question and answer chat. What are the support systems in place for the migrants in Suffolk County? And that's probably for Lewis, that can assist people who need immigration representation, but has no financial resource due to the current climate that caused a loss of jobs. Lewis, do you have any answer for Barbara there?
Yeah, so basically there's a couple of organizations, community-based organizations like Carecen, that's the Catholic charities too. There's a couple other groups that have gotten involved already in the process. I've seen also a lot of legislators, local as well as state legislators that are, like, for example, holding legal clinics with immigration attorneys so that they can answer some of the questions and obviously provide vital resources for the immigrant communities. So what I can do is I can send you, Dina and Guillermo, some of those links, and then maybe you can disseminate that to the audience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Louis. We also have a very general question with Brad Hindle. Any suggestions for dealing with the pushback in current climate, especially from bad faith actors, organized whisper campaigns, and misinformation? Any additional comments? I know David has alluded to the public awareness campaign, changing the narrative. This is a time when we really need all hands on deck. We need local government to and state government to step up and partner with community-based organizations and really do a public awareness campaign. But any other comments you would like to present in answer to Brad's question?
If I may, obviously that's part of the issues that we have been facing here, in New York State. We all are aware, for example, since bail reform has taken place, there's been a lot of rhetoric by certain groups, basically to blame a lot of those issues, even though the statistics show differently. Right? Even though we know that, for example, the FBI reports, the DCJS at the state level, Division of Criminal Justice at the state level, basically decision report year after year that crime is down, particularly in the suburban areas, but as well as New York City. But I think that we have let that rhetoric basically sink in. Make it, and unfortunately in politics, because this is a political issue, perception becomes reality. And I think that that's been basically on us, on this side of the advocacy, community, that we have not pushed back. We have to get out there. We have to make sure that we are not afraid to educate people and counter that false narrative, right? Like we have seen, for example, during campaign times where they, like, for example, there's been groups, when I'm going to mention a name because that was real, like, for example, one of the owners of Steel Lauder, Ron Lauder, right? Like got very much involved, targeting very specific districts in terms of the message that he was basically using that type of rhetoric. Basically equating immigration to criminality. And I think that that's something that we have to fight back. It's something that it's our responsibility to make sure that we invest the resources, because that's the other thing, right? They are putting money behind their campaigns. We, on the contrary, we think that we're going to be issuing an op-ed, that we're going to be issuing a report, and that everyone is going to read it. Part of the problem that we have is the way that we communicate. We have to make sure that we basically bring down, our academic language, our, very intellectual language, and find ways to communicate in a very effective way with,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely agree. This has been an incredibly rich discussion. Thanks to our panelists for helping us unpack what we mean by inclusive governance and the responsibilities of local governments to really step up and support and sponsor these strategies. Immigrant integration really takes place at the local level, and local governments have this responsibility to serve all residents, including foreign-born residents. So we shared some strategies here about inclusive governance that need to adapt services and programs so that all members of the communities have unrestricted access to healthcare, access to employment services, education, as well as safety and legal representation. It also means that programs need to incorporate the need for language training, skill development that address the unique needs of this population. We need information provided in multilingual formats for this population. We recall at the time of COVID, some of these communities had nothing to rely on in terms of accurate and factual information because there was a vacuum of information in their language that they can access. We need language assistance services in all of these domains. Newcomers need to have access to local advice that helps them bridge the knowledge and information gap. And there are mechanisms that help immigrants adapt their foreign-born obtained credentials to local labor markets. We need to adapt some of these mechanisms and make sure they are recognized and available. Inclusive governance also requires strategies to address segregation by improving neighborhood segregation, by improving public spaces, community development, support for small business, entrepreneurs, as David said, and public awareness campaigns that foster these inclusive social relations. We need to establish complaints registry at local government to report instances of discrimination, monitor and evaluate and report these instances. And to be effective, inclusive governments need to really establish concrete goals, measurable outcomes, as well as institute concrete evaluation goals and accountability mechanisms. They need to coordinate policies, partner with civil society to advance these goals. And we need a concerted effort to bring the voices of immigrants to the table, to the decision-making tables, and really listen to the voices and the needs, do needs assessment, and bring the leaders who can talk about the community and have them shape policies and practices with input from these communities affected by the problems. Thank you again to our distinguished panelists and our exceptional keynote speaker. We appreciate your wisdom and expertise. Thanks everybody for joining us, and hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, everybody.